A military corridor is easiest to misunderstand when it seems like plain countryside. This corridor isn't a dramatic mountain pass, not a famous strait, and not a spectacular wall on the edge of a continent. It is a land connection between Poland and Lithuania, framed by Belarus on one side and Russia's Kaliningrad region on the other. That placement gives it a weight that the terrain alone doesn't explain. The Baltic states are connected to the rest of NATO by air, sea, politics, planning, and command relationships, but the most direct land route runs through this exposed space. For a civilian driver, the corridor is road, forest, border, fuel stop, bridge, and winter weather. For a defense planner, the same area becomes a question of reinforcement speed, road capacity, rail compatibility, air defense, command timing, and political resolve. This difference between the civilian road and the strategic corridor is the heart of the story. That first pressure point is time. One road can be open and still not be fast enough for the kind of movement a crisis demands. Heavy vehicles need bridges that can take their weight, staging areas that can hold convoys, repair capacity, fuel distribution, and traffic management that doesn't collapse under stress. One map arrow from Warsaw toward the Baltic states hides all of those small frictions. That second pressure point is depth. The corridor isn't valuable because it is wide and comfortable. It is valuable because it is one of the few land options that connects the Baltic front to the rest of Allied territory. If pressure climbs around it, every kilometer starts to matter. One bridge becomes more than a bridge. One rail interchange becomes more than a rail interchange. One border procedure becomes more than paperwork. The third pressure point is signaling. Infrastructure here sends a military message even when no one calls it military infrastructure. A stronger highway, a better rail connection, a fortified energy substation, and a tested convoy route all say that reinforcement is more than promised in speeches. They say the promise has been measured against pavement, bridges, gauges, and time. That is why Via Baltica and Rail Baltica are so important to the corridor conversation. They are economic projects, but they also shift how quickly the region can be supported if the security environment worsens. Dual-use infrastructure isn't glamorous, yet it is often where deterrence becomes practical. A tank can't be reassured by a communique. A truck holding ammunition can't cross a weak bridge because a summit statement says it should. Logistics turns political commitments into movement, and movement has to happen across real ground. That narrow land link also forces NATO to think about vulnerability without exaggerating it. The corridor is sensitive, but that doesn't mean it is doomed. Forests, lakes, local roads, prepared forces, allied exercises, and the shifted Baltic Sea environment after Finland and Sweden joined NATO all complicate any simple invasion scenario. One narrow corridor can be a weakness for reinforcement and a difficult battlefield for an attacker at the same time. This is the kind of contradiction serious strategy has to hold. That public phrase, Achilles' heel, can be useful, but it can also flatten the problem into a slogan. One better way to see the corridor is as a timetable under pressure. How quickly can units move? How long can roads remain functional? How many alternate routes exist if the first road is blocked? How do civilian authorities, border services, rail operators, engineers, and military units coordinate without waiting for perfect conditions? Those questions don't produce a dramatic thumbnail, but they are what determine credibility. That corridor also connects to energy and communication infrastructure. Modern reinforcement depends on power, data, fuel, and repair capacity as much as it depends on armored vehicles. When substations, telecom nodes, rail yards, or fuel depots become vulnerable, the corridor's meaning expands beyond roads. A land choke point is more than a place where troops might pass. It is a network of support systems that has to remain usable while the political temperature is rising. This is why recent attention to protecting critical infrastructure on NATO's eastern flank fits the same story. The challenge is more than to defend a line on a map. It is to hold a connected region functioning while pressure is applied through drones, sabotage risk, disinformation, border disruption, or administrative confusion. That corridor, therefore, becomes a test of coordination. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, NATO headquarters, European transport planners, energy companies, and local authorities all have roles that overlap. No single actor owns the whole system. This makes preparation slower, but it also makes the corridor stronger when coordination improves. A new road doesn't solve the security problem by itself. A rail line doesn't remove geography, but each upgrade lowers one layer of friction. Every exercise reveals where paperwork, bridge strength, communications, or staging capacity might fail. Every repair yard, fuel plan, and traffic control rehearsal makes the corridor less theoretical. This is what deterrence seems like when it leaves the podium. It looks like maps verified against culverts. It seems like convoy timing on cold roads. It seems like police, engineers, soldiers, and rail managers learning how a crisis would pass through normal infrastructure. For the Baltic states, the corridor's value is psychological as well as logistical. A visible land connection to allies lowers the feeling of isolation. It also tells an adversary that pressure on the corridor would not be a local incident. It would touch the credibility of the alliance itself. That is why a small geographic area can hold a large political meaning. That most dangerous misunderstanding would be to think the corridor matters only if a war begins. In reality, it matters in the gray zone before a war, when messages, exercises, border incidents, cyber disruptions, and infrastructure scares test whether institutions can act calmly. One corridor that is trusted in peacetime is harder to intimidate in crisis. One corridor that is neglected in peacetime becomes a bargaining chip before anyone fires a shot. That land choke point proves that a bottleneck can be made of asphalt instead of water. Its leverage comes from movement, timing, and the fear of being cut off. Its resilience comes from preparation that looks boring until the day it matters. The real question isn't whether the corridor is vulnerable. Imagine the corridor during a tense week rather than during a declared war. Trucks are still moving, civilians still drive to work, fuel stations still operate, and politicians still describe the situation as controlled. At the same time, military planners begin asking whether the road network can handle movement that was never meant to look dramatic on television. This is when the problem becomes practical instead of theoretical. A crisis doesn't have to begin with tanks crossing a border. It can start with drone alerts, railway disruption, cyber pressure on traffic systems, suspicious incidents near substations, and confusing information about what is happening nearby. Every disturbance can be small enough to avoid a clear war threshold and still large enough to slow movement. This is the gray zone importance of the corridor. That question becomes whether a democratic alliance can coordinate quickly while still following law, civilian safety rules, and political procedure. Authoritarian pressure often tries to exploit the time it takes open systems to make decisions. This corridor's resilience, therefore, depends on habits built before the crisis. Police escorts, military convoy permits, bridge assessments, emergency repairs, customs coordination, and rail slot planning all matter before the first emergency order is signed. When those habits exist, the corridor can absorb pressure without immediately becoming chaotic. If they don't, a small disruption can force improvisation at exactly the wrong moment. Rail is especially important because heavy equipment movement isn't the same as civilian traffic. Armored vehicles, engineering gear, fuel, ammunition, and repair units place unusual demands on transport infrastructure. A modern reinforcement plan can't depend only on heroic driving along a single road. It needs rail capacity, loading areas, road alternatives, maintenance teams, and a way to hold civilian movement from being paralyzed. That corridor therefore connects military mobility with public infrastructure investment. If a bridge is strengthened, a tunnel modified, or a road upgraded, the benefit isn't only faster civilian travel. It may also lower the time between a political decision and actual reinforcement. This time gap is where deterrence can weaken. An adversary doesn't need to defeat every ally. It may only need to convince a region that help will arrive too late. Its importance lies in measuring credibility in hours, not slogans. Each exercise around the corridor is a rehearsal of institutional friction. Can units communicate across borders without delay? Can civilian authorities reroute traffic without creating panic? Can repair crews restore a damaged node quickly enough? Can fuel and spare parts reach the same places as the combat units? Those questions are unglamorous, but they define the difference between a symbolic corridor and a functional one. The Baltic Sea also shifts the land problem. With Finland and Sweden inside NATO, the regional map has more allied depth than it once had. That doesn't erase the land corridor, but it shifts how the corridor fits inside the wider reinforcement picture. Sea and air routes can support resilience, while the land route remains the most direct physical connection to the European mainland. In other words, the corridor is no longer the only story, but it is still a story that can't be ignored. That is the kind of nuance that high-pressure discussions often lose. One corridor can be less catastrophic than a slogan suggests and still be strategically vital. It may be defensible and still vulnerable. It may be narrow and still supported by multiple layers of planning. What matters most is whether those layers are real, funded, exercised, and politically understood. That local population also sits inside the strategic picture. A corridor isn't an empty military board. It contains communities, farms, roads, local governments, schools, power lines, and daily life. When reinforcement planning ignores that reality, the corridor becomes a source of friction with the very society it is meant to protect. Civil resilience is therefore not a soft add-on. It is part of the corridor's working system. Information discipline matters as well. In a crisis, rumors about a blocked bridge or a border closure can move faster than official clarification. This can clog roads, frighten civilians, and force authorities to spend energy correcting confusion instead of managing movement. One secure corridor needs credible communication, not only armored vehicles. This is the point where infrastructure and trust meet. One road can be physically open, but if the public doesn't trust the instructions around it, movement can still fail. A rail plan can exist on paper, but if operators have not practiced military loads, the plan may discover problems too late. Preparedness turns theoretical access into usable access. That gap should not be treated as a prophecy of disaster. It should be treated as a demanding test of whether Europe has learned that logistics are strategic. That corridor asks whether investment has matched rhetoric. It asks whether Allied reassurance has a physical route underneath it. And it asks whether a narrow strip of land can remain plain enough for daily life, while prepared enough for extraordinary pressure. That is the balance the region has to maintain. Too much alarm can turn the corridor into a symbol of fear. Too little attention can turn it into a neglected weakness. The strongest answer is neither panic nor complacency. It is steady preparation that makes the corridor less useful as a tool of intimidation. Another way to read the corridor is through the difference between access and throughput. Access means a route exists. Throughput means enough people, vehicles, fuel, spare parts, and command systems can pass through that route at the needed pace. That debate often focuses on access because access is easy to show on a map. Throughput is less visible and more decisive. One single road may technically connect allies while still struggling under crisis volume. One rail route may be politically important while still needing loading sites, gauge compatibility, repair crews, and secure communications. One border crossing may be open while traffic control becomes the limiting factor. This corridor's military value, therefore, depends on the weakest practical step in the movement chain. When paperwork slows convoys, paperwork becomes strategy. If a bridge can't handle certain vehicles, bridge engineering becomes deterrence. If fuel can't be distributed fast enough, fuel logistics becomes the actual speed limit. That is why infrastructure investment in the area should not be judged only by peacetime travel time. One highway that saves civilians time may also shorten the delay between warning and reinforcement. One rail upgrade that improves freight may also widen the options for military mobility. This region's geography also requires careful public messaging. Residents should not be made to feel they live inside a permanent battlefield prediction. At the same time, honest preparation requires acknowledging that their roads and services may be asked to perform under pressure. That best resilience plans respect daily life while preparing for emergency use. They don't turn every village into a fortress, and they do not pretend geography has no strategic meaning. That corridor also links to Europe's larger problem of moving heavy equipment across borders. Tanks, engineering vehicles, air defense systems, and support trucks don't move like normal consumer freight. They require permits, rail cars, trained loaders, route surveys, and political coordination. If Europe wants deterrence to be credible, those details can't be solved after a crisis begins. That narrow place exposes a continent-wide mobility question. This is why it belongs in this channel's framework. It isn't only a border strip, It is a ledger entry for the cost of turning alliance promises into movement. One final layer is maintenance under pressure. Roads and railways can be built to high standards. But crisis use exposes whether repair crews, spare parts, and traffic control systems can operate while public anxiety is rising. That corridor also depends on political patience. When every movement is treated as escalation, reinforcement becomes harder to practice. If nothing is practiced, the first serious movement becomes more alarming. This balance is why exercises matter. They make unusual movement less unusual, and they reveal practical weaknesses while there is still time to correct them. That most successful corridor is the one that looks boring because its institutions have already done the difficult work. One narrow corridor also magnifies small administrative delays. A convoy paused for paperwork may produce a tailback that blocks civilian traffic and slows the next military movement. One rail slot missed by one load can force several other loads to wait behind it. This is why the corridor is a system of sequence, not only a strip of land. That goal is to make the first hour of a crisis less confused than the adversary expects. That real question is whether the systems around it can move faster than the pressure placed upon it. When they can, the corridor becomes a deterrent. If they can't, a narrow strip of land can make an entire region feel farther away than it looks on the map.